Hashima Island, the Island of Silence. A screenplay for hushed horizons. There is a place in the East China Sea where concrete rises from the water like the hull of a warship anchored in time. From the mainland, approximately 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki, you can see its silhouette on clear days, a jagged line of buildings pressed so tightly together they appear as a single fortress emerging from the waves. This is Hashima Island, though most people know it by another name. Gunkanjima, or Battleship Island. The nickname fits. When mist rolls across the water in the early morning hours, the island's profile resembles a Japanese battleship from the early 20th century, complete with towers that look like gun turrets and walls that could be the armored flanks of a naval vessel. But this battleship never sailed. It simply sat, grew, filled with thousands of lives, and then emptied completely in the span of a few months in 1974. Today, Hashima is silent. The wind moves through its corridors. Seabirds nest in windows that once framed the faces of children. Rain falls through ceilings that sheltered families who laughed, argued, ate dinner together, and watched television in tiny apartments stacked 9 stories high. The island measures just 480 meters from north to south and 160 meters from east to west. You could walk its perimeter in less than 20 minutes. Yet at its peak in 1959, this small piece of reclaimed land held 5,259 people. Making it, at that moment in time, the most densely populated place on Earth. More crowded than Hong Kong. More compressed than Manhattan. A vertical city built on a rock barely larger than a few city blocks, surrounded entirely by ocean. Now, it holds no one. The population dropped from more than 5,000 to 0 in a matter of weeks. What remains are the buildings, the pathways between them, the staircases that connected neighbors, the communal bathhouses, the school where children learned to read and write, the shrine at the highest point of the island where miners prayed for safety before descending into the earth. All of it stands empty. Concrete slowly returns to dust. Steel rusts and warps under the relentless assault of salt air and typhoon winds. This is Hashima. A place where time stopped suddenly, leaving behind a monument to both human ambition and the inevitability of change. The story of Hashima begins not with people, but with coal. Around 1810, during the final years of Japan's Edo period, someone discovered thick seams of high-quality coal embedded in the rocky seafloor near a small, barren island. At the time, Hashima was little more than a reef. A jagged piece of volcanic rock jutting above the waterline, too small and inhospitable for habitation. Fishermen avoided it. There was no fresh water, no soil, nothing that could sustain life. But beneath the surface, extending deep into the earth and spreading outward under the ocean floor, was something valuable, coal of exceptional quality, dense and rich with carbon, perfect for powering the steam engines and steel furnaces that were beginning to transform the world. For decades, mining operations remained small-scale. Local families extracted coal in modest quantities, using simple tools and shallow shafts. But in 1890, everything changed. The Mitsubishi Corporation, already one of Japan's most powerful industrial conglomerates, purchased the island for 100,000 yen, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to about 75 kilograms of gold. Mitsubishi saw what others had not, the potential for large-scale undersea coal extraction. Japan was modernizing rapidly, building railroads, constructing naval vessels, establishing steel mills. The nation needed fuel, and Hashima could provide it. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering projects of the early 20th century. Mitsubishi began by expanding the island itself. The original reef was tiny, barely a hectare in area. Through a series of 6 major land reclamation projects, workers dumped thousands of tons of rock and rubble into the sea, building up the shoreline and tripling the island's size. Massive concrete seawalls were constructed to protect this new land from the ocean's fury. The walls were built thick and tall, designed to withstand the typhoons that regularly swept across the East China Sea with waves powerful enough to overturn ships and demolish wooden structures. Then came the buildings. In 1916, Mitsubishi constructed what would become a landmark in Japanese architectural history, Building No. 30, Japan's first reinforced concrete high-rise apartment block. It rose 7 stories above the island's rocky core, a tower of gray concrete that could house dozens of mining families in relative safety. Concrete was chosen specifically because of the environment. Wood would rot in the constant humidity and salt spray. Wood would splinter and collapse when typhoon winds reached their peak. But concrete, reinforced with steel bars, could endure. It could stand against the elements for decades, maybe even centuries. Building No. 30 was just the beginning. Over the next several decades, more than 30 concrete structures were raised on Hashima, each one pressed tightly against its neighbors, filling every available space on the small island. There were apartment blocks, some rising 9 stories high. There was a school, complete with classrooms, a gymnasium, and a playground adapted to the limited space available. There was a hospital, shops, bathhouses, a cinema, restaurants, even a pachinko parlor for entertainment. Everything needed to support a community was built within those few hectares of reclaimed land. The island became, in essence, a self-contained city. A concrete ecosystem where thousands of people lived, worked, and raised children, all while floating on a piece of rock 15 kilometers from the mainland. Looking at Hashima from the sea, you could see the result of this extraordinary construction effort. A dense cluster of buildings rising abruptly from the water, their walls forming an unbroken perimeter, their windows stacked in perfect rows, their rooftops reaching toward the sky. There were no parks, no open fields, barely any trees. Space was too precious. Every square meter had a purpose. The island's nickname, Battleship Island, was well earned. It looked like a fortress. It looked like something built for war. To understand what life was like on Hashima, you have to imagine density beyond what most of us have ever experienced. At the island's peak in 1959, the population density in the residential district reached 1,391 people per hectare. In modern terms, that's roughly 139,100 people per square kilometer. To put this in perspective, even the most crowded cities today rarely exceed 40,000 people per square kilometer. Hashima was nearly 3.5 times denser than that. People lived on top of each other, beside each other, in every available corner of the island. Privacy was a luxury that simply did not exist. The typical apartment on Hashima consisted of a single room measuring about 9.9 square meters, roughly the size of 6 tatami mats laid side by side. This one room served as bedroom, living room, and dining room. There was a small window, a door, and a narrow vestibule. That was all. Families with children somehow made this tiny space work. Bathrooms and kitchens were communal, shared by dozens of residents on each floor. You would wake in the morning, prepare for the day in your small room, then walk down the corridor to the shared bath or kitchen, likely encountering neighbors doing the same. Everyone knew everyone. There was no avoiding it. The walls were thin, the hallways narrow, the staircases connecting different levels of the building always busy with foot traffic. And yet, despite these cramped conditions, life on Hashima was, by many accounts, relatively prosperous. Mitsubishi paid its miners well. The company provided housing, electricity, and water at low cost or sometimes free of charge. By the mid-1950s, during what became known as Japan's economic miracle, residents of Hashima enjoyed a standard of living that was remarkably high for the time. Nearly every apartment had a television, an expensive luxury in the 1950s that cost 1 to 2 months' salary. Refrigerators became common. Washing machines appeared in homes. Electric rice cookers, radios, modern conveniences that urban residents on the mainland could barely afford were standard on this tiny island floating in the sea. The reason was simple: the work was dangerous, and Mitsubishi needed to keep its workforce happy and stable. Mining coal from beneath the ocean floor was not like digging in a hillside or an open pit. The shafts on Hashima extended more than a kilometer deep, tunneling through rock and following seams of coal that spread outward under the seabed. Miners descended each day into darkness, into heat that reached 30 degrees Celsius, into air thick with humidity at 95%. The walls dripped water. The tunnels were narrow. Gas collected in pockets, invisible and deadly. Cave-ins were a constant risk. Explosions from methane pockets killed workers regularly. Some accounts suggest 4 to 5 miners died every month. This was not a safe occupation. It was a gamble. Miners knew they might not come back up. To balance this danger, life above ground was made as comfortable as possible. The island had schools where children received a quality education, comparable to what they would get on the mainland. There was a hospital with doctors and nurses to treat injuries and illnesses. There were shops selling food, clothing, and daily necessities. There were restaurants where families could eat out, bathhouses where they could relax after a long day, and a cinema where residents could watch the latest films. There were festivals, celebrations for New Year, for Obon, for the shrine's annual Yamagami festival held every April 3rd, when the entire island gathered to honor the spirits of the mountain gods and pray for safety in the mines. Despite the isolation, despite the density, despite the danger lurking below the surface, Hashima had a rhythm. It had a community. People formed bonds. Children grew up knowing every other child on the island. Neighbors helped each other. There was a sense of solidarity that came from shared experience, from living in such close quarters, from facing the same risks and the same rewards. Even the island's relationship with nature became part of daily life. Typhoons were frequent, especially during the summer and autumn months. When storms approached, massive waves would crash over the seawalls, flooding the lower levels of buildings, sending spray high into the air. Residents learned to watch for these storms. Some even climbed to the rooftops of the tallest buildings to witness the spectacle: huge walls of water slamming against concrete, the sound like thunder, the force enough to shake the entire structure. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. The island was in constant battle with the sea. The seawalls held. The buildings endured. And life continued. In 1957, a significant improvement came: fresh water. Until then, all water had to be shipped from the mainland in boats, stored in tanks, rationed carefully. But in 1957, underwater pipes were laid, connecting Hashima to Nagasaki's reservoirs. Fresh water flowed onto the island for the first time in its history. With this new resource, residents began experimenting with rooftop gardens. They carried soil from the mainland, spread it across the flat concrete roofs, and planted vegetables, flowers, small trees. These gardens became precious spaces. Tiny patches of green in an otherwise gray landscape. Children who had never seen a tree growing in soil could now watch tomatoes ripen, smell flowers bloom. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It made the island feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Below the apartments, below the schools and shops, below the bustling streets and staircases, was another world entirely, the mine. This was the reason Hashima existed. Every building, every wall, every person on the island was there because of the coal beneath the ocean floor. For main shafts penetrated deep into the earth, some reaching depths of over a kilometer. These shafts connected to a labyrinth of tunnels that followed the coal seams in all directions, extending far beyond the island's borders, spreading out under the seafloor like the roots of an enormous tree. The work was grueling. Miners descended in cage elevators, metal boxes that dropped them hundreds of meters into the earth. The descent took minutes, the air growing warmer and more oppressive the deeper they went. At the bottom, they disembarked into tunnels lit only by the lamps on their helmets. The ceilings were low. In many places, miners had to crouch or crawl to reach the coal face. The air was thick with dust, humidity, and the smell of rock and sweat. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling and walls. The temperature hovered around 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher. Within minutes of starting work, clothes were soaked through with perspiration. The mining process required both skill and physical strength. Teams of miners worked together, typically in pairs. One miner, the Sakiyama, would be at the front, using a pickaxe or pneumatic drill to break coal loose from the seam. Behind him, the Atoyama would load the broken coal into carts, which were then pushed or pulled along narrow-gauge rails to collection points. It was repetitive, exhausting work. Shifts lasted 8 to 10 hours, sometimes longer when production quotas needed to be met. Miners were paid based on how much coal they extracted, which created pressure to work faster, to take risks, to push themselves beyond safe limits. The dangers were constant and varied. Methane gas accumulated in pockets throughout the mine. A spark from metal striking rock could ignite it, causing an explosion that would rip through tunnels, killing everyone nearby. Carbon monoxide could build up in poorly ventilated areas, suffocating workers before they realized what was happening. The walls and ceilings were always at risk of collapse. Small tremors, shifts in the rock, the weakening of support beams, any of these could trigger a cave-in. When accidents happened, there was often little that could be done. Rescue efforts were difficult in such confined spaces. Bodies were sometimes left where they fell, the tunnels deemed too unstable to recover them. Despite these conditions, miners took pride in their work. There was a hierarchy based on skill. Miners were classified into 10 levels, from novice to master. Each year, they could take exams to advance to the next level, which came with higher pay and greater respect. The top level, level 9 or 10, was reserved for the second in Sakiyama, the lead miners who supervised entire sections of the mine and were responsible for the safety and productivity of their teams. These were men with years of experience, who knew the tunnels intimately, who could read the subtle signs in the rock that indicated danger or opportunity. The coal they extracted was of exceptional quality, high-grade coking coal, perfect for steelmaking. It was shipped from Hashima to steel mills across Japan, where it fueled the furnaces that produced the steel for ships, for buildings, for railroads, for the infrastructure of a rapidly modernizing nation. During World War II, Hashima's coal production reached its peak, 410,000 tons in 1941. The island was working at maximum capacity, extracting coal as quickly as possible to support Japan's war effort. But this achievement came at a terrible human cost, a darker chapter in the island's history that cannot be ignored. During the war years, with most able-bodied Japanese men conscripted into the military, there was a severe labor shortage. To fill the gaps, the Japanese government forcibly brought workers from Korea and China. These were not volunteers. They were conscripted laborers, many of them prisoners of war, forced to work in conditions that were even harsher than those faced by Japanese miners. They were given inadequate food, minimal rest, and subjected to brutal treatment. Many did not survive. Records indicate that hundreds of Korean and Chinese workers died on Hashima between the early 1940s and the end of the war in 1945, victims of accidents, exhaustion, malnutrition, and violence. After the war ended, this forced labor ceased. Hashima returned to more conventional mining operations, employing Japanese workers under better conditions. But the memory of those years remained, a shadow over the island's history. By the 1960s, the world was changing. Japan's economy had recovered from the devastation of World War II and was entering a period of extraordinary growth. But the energy that powered this growth was shifting. For decades, coal had been Japan's primary industrial fuel. Coal powered the trains, the factories, the steel mills, the ships. Coal was king. But petroleum was rising. Oil was cheaper, cleaner, easier to transport and refine. It could be imported in massive quantities from the Middle East and other regions. As Japan's energy policy shifted toward oil, demand for domestic coal began to fall. For Hashima, this shift was catastrophic. The island had no purpose beyond coal. Without the mine, there was no reason for anyone to live there. The coal seams were also nearing depletion. After more than 80 years of intensive extraction, the highest quality deposits had been exhausted. What remained was deeper, harder to reach, less profitable. Mitsubishi began reducing the workforce, offering retraining programs, transferring miners to other facilities on the mainland. The population started to decline. By the early 1970s, fewer than 2,000 people remained on the island, down from more than 5,000 a decade earlier. Then came the final blow. On January 15, 1974, Mitsubishi held a ceremony in the island's gymnasium. Company officials stood before the remaining workers and their families and made an announcement. The mine would close. Operations would cease immediately. Everyone would have to leave. The island would be evacuated. The news was not entirely unexpected, many had seen it coming, but it was still shocking. For the families who had lived on Hashima for years, sometimes for generations, this place was home. Their entire lives were built here. Their children had been born here, attended school here, made friends here. Now, in a matter of weeks, they would have to pack up and leave, likely never to return. The evacuation proceeded quickly. Mitsubishi arranged transportation. Ferries ran back and forth between Hashima and Nagasaki, carrying families and their belongings. The company helped workers find new housing, new jobs on the mainland. But there was little time for sentimentality. By April 20, 1974, just 3 months after the closure announcement, the last resident stepped onto a ferry, holding an umbrella against a light rain, and looked back at the island one final time. The schools were empty. The shops were closed. The apartments were silent. Hashima, which had been continuously inhabited since 1887, was now completely abandoned. What the residents left behind tells its own story. In their haste, many people did not take everything. Apartments still contained furniture, chairs, tables, beds. Kitchens had pots and dishes stacked neatly. Living rooms had televisions sitting on shelves, newspapers folded on coffee tables. Children's toys were scattered on floors. School classrooms had desks in rows, chalkboards with lessons still written on them. The hospital had medical equipment, examination tables, filing cabinets full of patient records. The cinema had its projector, its seats, posters for films that would never be shown again. It was as if everyone had simply walked away, expecting to return. But they did not return. The doors closed. The lights went out. And Hashima became a ghost. For 35 years, from 1974 to 2009, Hashima Island was closed to the public. Mitsubishi retained ownership until 2002, when it transferred the island to Takashima Town, which was later absorbed by Nagasaki City. But even under municipal control, the island remained off-limits. It was too dangerous. The buildings, which had been abandoned without maintenance, were deteriorating rapidly. Typhoons battered the structures year after year, each storm peeling away more concrete, shattering more windows, weakening more support beams. Salt spray from the ocean accelerated the corrosion of the steel reinforcement bars embedded in the concrete. Without these bars to hold the concrete together, entire sections of walls and ceilings began to collapse. Floors gave way. Staircases crumbled. What had once been solid, permanent structures were becoming ruins. The isolation helped preserve some things. Because no one was allowed on the island, vandalism was minimal. Scavengers could not easily reach Hashima to strip it of valuables. The apartments, schools, and other buildings remained largely as they had been left in 1974. Inside, time seemed frozen. Visitors who later gained access described walking into rooms where everything was still in place. A teapot on a table, a calendar on the wall showing April 1974, a bicycle leaning against a wall, children's drawings pinned to a bulletin board. It was eerie. It was like walking through a moment that had been suddenly paused, with no one to press play again. Nature began to reclaim parts of the island, though slowly. The concrete surfaces and lack of soil made it difficult for plants to establish themselves. But in cracks and crevices, small weeds sprouted. Moss grew on shaded walls. Seabirds nested in the empty window frames of the high-rise buildings, their calls echoing through corridors that had once carried the voices of children. The island was not entirely lifeless, but the life that remained was wild, indifferent to the human structures surrounding it. In the early 2000s, interest in Hashima began to grow. Urban explorers, photographers, and historians became fascinated by the island's unique state of preservation. A few individuals managed to visit illegally, documenting what they found with cameras and publishing images online. These photographs spread, capturing the imagination of people around the world. Here was a place where an entire community had simply vanished, leaving behind a concrete shell that was slowly dissolving back into the sea. It was haunting. It was beautiful in a melancholic way. It was a perfect symbol of impermanence, of how even the most solid and seemingly permanent human creations eventually fall apart. This growing interest led to official action. In 2009, Nagasaki City opened a small portion of Hashima to guided tours. Visitors could now travel by boat from Nagasaki port to the island, walk along designated paths, and view the ruins from 3 observation points. Safety was paramount. The crumbling buildings were too unstable to allow people to enter them or wander freely. But even from a distance, the experience was powerful. Standing on the island, looking up at the towering apartment blocks with their empty windows and crumbling facades, hearing the wind whistle through the abandoned streets, feeling the salt spray from the waves crashing against the seawalls, it brought home the reality of what Hashima had been and what it had become. In 2015, Hashima was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of the Sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, iron and steel, shipbuilding, and coal mining. The designation was controversial, particularly because of the island's history of forced labor during World War II. South Korea and China objected, arguing that Japan had not adequately acknowledged or memorialized the suffering of the conscripted workers. Japan committed to addressing this issue, to establishing informational displays and interpretive materials that would tell the full story, including the painful chapters. But implementation has been slow and contentious. The debate continues to this day. Today, Hashima remains a place of contradictions. It is a tourist attraction, drawing thousands of visitors each year who are curious to see this unusual piece of history. But it is also a site of ongoing decay, a place where nature and time are slowly erasing what humans built. The concrete continues to crumble. Typhoons continue to batter the structures. Engineers and preservationists struggle to stabilize key buildings, knowing that full restoration is impossible. The question is not whether Hashima will eventually collapse completely, but when. Walking through the island now. Or rather, walking through the small portions of it that are accessible to the public, you feel the weight of absence. The silence is profound. There are no voices, no footsteps, no sounds of daily life. Only the wind, the waves, the occasional cry of a seabird. The concrete walls that once echoed with laughter and conversation now stand mute. The staircases that children once raced up and down are empty, their steps leading nowhere. The apartments where families gathered for dinner, where couples argued and made up, where babies were born and elderly residents passed away, all of these spaces are hollow now, their stories fading along with the physical structures. And yet, the memories persist. Former residents of Hashima, now elderly, sometimes return as part of tours. They point out where they lived, where they went to school, where they played as children. They remember the names of neighbors, the taste of food from the island's restaurants, the feeling of watching typhoon waves from the rooftops. For them, Hashima is not just a ruin. It is a place where they lived real lives, full of the same joys and sorrows, hopes and disappointments that people experience anywhere. The island may be silent now, but it was once loud with the noise of humanity, with industry, with community, with life compressed into every available space. Hashima Island is a monument to many things. It is a monument to Japan's rapid industrialization, to the ambition and engineering skill that transformed a barren rock into a thriving city. It is a monument to the workers who descended into the earth each day to extract coal, who risked and sometimes lost their lives in the darkness below. It is a monument to the resilience of communities that form even in the most challenging circumstances. And it is a monument to impermanence, to the way that everything we build, no matter how solid it seems, eventually returns to dust. The concrete will continue to crumble. The steel will continue to rust. The buildings will, one by one, collapse into rubble. In time, perhaps a century, perhaps two, there may be nothing left of Hashima's structures except scattered debris and the seawall that holds back the ocean. The island will return to what it was before people arrived. A small rock in the sea, home only to birds and waves and wind. But for now, Hashima stands. It stands as a reminder of what was, and what will always pass. It stands as a place where thousands of people once lived, worked, loved, and eventually left. It stands in silence, waiting for the waves to carry it away. If you ever have the chance to visit, to stand on that small patch of concrete surrounded by the East China Sea, take a moment to listen. Not just to the wind, but to the silence itself. Because in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes, of footsteps on staircases, of children's laughter, of miners descending into the earth, of a community that existed in one of the most unlikely places imaginable, and then vanished, leaving behind only concrete and memory. If you found this story moving, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Hushed Horizons. We tell stories about forgotten places and silent tales from different countries around the world. There are so many places like Hashima, places where history lingers in the air, where the past speaks if you know how to listen. Join us as we continue to explore these quiet corners of the world, one story at a time.